Comrade President, all the other dignitaries present. I just see Maulana Bam has also arrived. It's a singular honor to be here today, to be a part of this event. When I was sitting next to Comrade Edward Arison, who represents the churches here today and the National Coalition for a Free Palestine, the one word that came to mind in the religious sector was contestations. There was always contestations in the religious sector about what kind of Christianity is required in an apartheid South Africa. Those of us who come from the liberation struggle tradition will know that there was ongoing contestations, even inside the liberation movement. And today, there are contestations about South Africa. Sometimes the contestations come out in very raw forms, around issues of, say, state capture, for example, around issues of corruption, around issues of the role of the banks, around issues of nationalization. But we have always acknowledged the notion of contestations. And sometimes it's unclear which way these contestations will go. But the one area that remain uncontested in our country's narrative is the narrative of international solidarity. That our non-racial, non-sexist, and undivided South Africa was the product of a number of struggles. And one of those struggles was the international solidarity one. The idea, and many of you lived in exile, the idea or the fact of thousands of ordinary church goers contributing on a weekly basis to the anti-apartheid movement. I've just come from London, where I reminisced extensively about marching the streets of London with people like Abdul Minty, people like Terry, I forgot Terry's surname now. Terry? No, in the anti-apartheid movement. Terry Bell? No, it was a Britisher. Terry Bell is a South African. People like Archbishop Trevor Huddleston. Terry? Mike Terry. It was Mike Terry. People like Glenys Kinnock. We walked the streets of London, marching onto Downing Street for various South African causes. Our organization, the Call of Islam, was funded by the Norwegian Council of Churches and the Swedish Council of Churches. And so international solidarity played a huge role in our country's liberation. And that is the narrative of BDS. Today in Europe, and sometimes in pro-Israeli circles, they want to suggest that our movement it's an illegitimate movement, born of illegitimate parents, the parents of anti-Semitism, the parents of don't buy from the Jews, this paradigm that operated in Nazi Germany, the old European Christian narrative of Jews as the drinkers of Christ's blood, an old ancient anti-Semitic tradition. No, our movement is a child born on the streets of Moscow, on the camps of Morogoro, on the streets of the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, on the streets of the United States, on the streets of the Middle East, where people came out in support of our people's struggle. That is where our movement was born. Comrades, in reflecting on the situation there, very often it's now becoming increasingly current, where people are sent on trips and so on to Israel on the one hand, and on the other hand, all the people that are sent by the churches and the solidarity movement are turned away at the borders. So they're becoming much more selective about who they are allowing to see. But even when we are allowed to see, we very often see what we want to see. Very quickly, I often use the analogy of the red light districts in Amsterdam or Hamburg. If you go through those areas, you can see, if you want to, just very sexy women, because you are going as a sex tourist. And if you want to, you can see that behind those smiling, winking, sexy women with the most, I don't have to be too vivid, your imaginations are strong enough, it doesn't have to be too strong. But if you want to, you can also see a woman sold in captivity. You can see a pimp behind the scenes. You can see a woman without any documentation. You can see gender oppression and exploitation and a modern form of slavery at its worst. So what you see is determined by your interest. If you're interested in human beings and in the marginalized of the world, rather than only your own sexual and prurient interests of the moment, then you'll see something completely different. It's like coming to apartheid South Africa and going only to our beaches, only to our five-star hotels, only to the top of our mountains, and you see the smiling faces of your domestic workers, and you don't realize that just on the top floor, unnumbered, in the apartment building where I stay in Killarney, we have 5 floors. Nobody speaks about the 6th floor. The 6th floor is where the black workers live, in small little hovels. So you can come and say, I've been to Killarney, forget about the beaches, forget about the mountains. I've been to Killarney, I saw 5 floors, because you did not want to see a 6th floor. And so we go to Palestine, we go to Israel, and we only see the hotels, we see the boulevards, we see how people are cooperating with each other, we see the smiling Palestinians building their own walls, their own prison walls. We see what we want to see. We see what our paid and very carefully trained tourist guides want to show us. South Africa has taught us to see the world through the eyes of the marginalized. And we need to be very careful that we don't confuse the narrative of a shared reconciliation, a love, the narrative of Mandela going to Betsy Verwoerd, sharing koeksisters with Betsy Verwoerd, the narrative of Desmond Tutu breaking down and weeping at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that we don't confuse that narrative of a post-apartheid South Africa with the narrative of Mandela, who stayed in prison and could have been out of prison for at least 10 years before that, had Mandela renounced violence. So our country's story, part of our country's story, is having found each other, this rainbow story. It's a bit of a flawed narrative, but it's become a part of our country's narrative. But the other part of our narrative, so it's Mandela, Madiba, the reconciler, but there's also Mandela, the holy Shlashla, Mandela, the uprooter, Mandela, the shit stirrer. And in situations of manifest injustice, our responsibility is essentially to go around and remind people of their injustice. When a woman is being abused by her husband, and you see all the blue marks on her face, your responsibility is not to encourage that woman to go back to her husband. Your responsibility is to say, end your abuse of women now. My responsibility is to look after this woman now. For that man to speak about how he was also abused once upon a time and is only defending himself against future abuse, I'm sorry, Icona, that's not going to work with me. Friends, I want to conclude by saying that we're living in a time where millions of dollars are being spent to delegitimate the Palestinian narrative. the narrative of occupation, the narrative of dispossession, and to foreground the narrative of anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism is unfortunately alive and well in the world today. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in the world today. The reality is that black racism is very alive and very well with huge systemic and economic power behind it. The reality is that Islamophobia is also on the rise in the world. It doesn't help for one narrative like this to compete against another narrative. But we will say this, that if you insist that the only narrative that matters in the middle of this is your own narrative, I'm sorry. At some stage, the privileging of the anti-Semitic narrative over the narrative of the oppression of women, or over the narrative of black lives that also matter, I will suspect that what is going on here is firstly another form of white privilege, and secondly simply a way of avoiding the key question, and that is of justice for a people who are currently living under occupation, the Palestinians. Finally, I want to say Comrade Mandela had warned us against speaking in muddled terms when it comes to the Palestinian people. A country that is the fourth largest military force in the world. A country that has the ear of every single United States president and both ears of the current president, a bit of a pariah in the international community, loved nowhere in the world except the state of Israel and some of the back streets of the United States itself. So friends, we need to remind ourselves from time to time, as these many contestations are taking place, and many of us are activists in these contestations, about what our country is really about. But the one thing that we shouldn't and cannot forget is that our country is a country founded on millions of people who lived and gave their everything for our country. Let us not forget the Cuban lives that died in Angola for our country. Let us not forget the huge cost to the economy of our neighboring countries when South Africa invaded those countries and regularly destroyed the infrastructure of those countries. South Africa was founded on the blood of our neighboring African countries. And this is why it makes the xenophobia and this terror that our fellow Africans have to live through so particularly dreadful. So comrades, we are a country that have been founded on other people caring for us, on other people going out on a limb for us. We particularly remember, and I will conclude on this note, we will particularly remember how the Palestinians, in the form of the PLO and the other Palestine resistance formations, how they went out on a limb for our movement, and the bonds forged when we were in exile and those movements were in exile. The only way that we can continue to be true to those memories and to in some ways redeem our debt is by an ongoing remembrance of what is going there, a reminding of our people, more and more events like this, and relentless pressure on our government to implement the various resolutions of the ruling party, of the African National Congress, to make sure that Israel, in its current state, as an apartheid state, no longer walks around the world with impunity and inflicts the kind of suffering that it does onto the Palestinians. Thank you very much.